Good morning. Good morning. Good morning, my chatty colleagues. Lovely to see all of you here again. For those of you who are just joining us today, I know there are some new people who arrived this morning. Welcome. For those of you who were here yesterday and are back again today, congratulations on surviving day one. And I hope you all had a really good evening and a refreshing night's sleep and are feeling fortified again. So we're delighted to begin day two today with a really exciting session, which is going to be a dialogue between Andy George from the Christchurch Cole Foundation and Lydia Khalil from Deakin University and also the Lowy Institute, who are going to be in conversation with each other about navigating the changing online safety landscape with the Christchurch Cole Foundation. Just before Andy and Lydia come up and begin their conversation with each other, for those of you who are joining us today, just a couple of quick either reminders or new information. In terms of emergency and evacuation procedures, listen for any announcements, but Deakin staff will guide us to the exit, so you don't need to worry about finding things yourselves. If everybody could please remember to now turn their phones to silent. And I think that's, oh yes, and for those new people who are with us today for the first time, in your program of materials, you will find on the inside front cover a QR code that will take you to the full bio notes and abstracts for all the different presentations today to help inform your choices about which of the sessions, when we run parallel sessions, you're going to be attending. And with that, I would like to invite Lydia and Andy to come up.
Morning, everyone. Can everyone hear us, or these lapel mics on? No. Maybe I've got to turn it on. That would help. Hello, hello. Aha, there. Good morning, everybody. It's great to see you on the second day of the conference. I'm sorry to those over on this side of the room who might not be able to see us so well, but we'll try to carry. Always pleased to be at the annual AVERT conference. It's always such a terrific gathering, and it's so great to see so many people here, old faces, new faces. So thank you again for joining us. And today, as Michelle said, I'm going to be chatting with Andy George, who is the Deputy Chief Executive Director of the Christchurch Call. Just introduce Andy a little bit. Andy, before coming on board of the Christchurch Call, was the Counterterrorism Strategic Coordinator for the New Zealand Department of Premier and Cabinet, which led New Zealand's counterterrorism and national security efforts. And prior to that, he was the head of CTAG, which is a terrorism risk assessment center over at New Zealand, an interagency group that does that. So it's wonderful to have our neighbors from across the chasm joining us to get that perspective, but also to get your perspective, not just from New Zealand, but also through your global and transnational work through the Christchurch Call Foundation. And I know many of you are very familiar with the Christchurch Call, the reason why it came into being, but I thought it would help to remind us a little bit before we get into conversation with Andy, because we obviously know that it came about after the 2019 Christchurch attacks in New Zealand, which killed many people in two places of worship and two mosques in Christchurch. And it was very, I think, interesting and galvanizing how all of those efforts came through the Christchurch Call, where we recognize that not only do we have to be dealing with this a threat of far-right extremism that was emerging and bubbling up, and that would perhaps that we had taken us quite a while to get our heads around, but also what the online environment was doing and what role that played in terms of radicalization, what content was, what communities, what all of this space, this online space that was global and transnational was impacting the effort that we all work on, which is countering violent extremism and terrorism. So the Christchurch Call was set up as a government initiative between the governments of New Zealand and France, and now it is moved on to a nonprofit foundation. So it's an interesting evolution of that. So I think, Andy, your experiences both working for a nation state level government, working through and observing how the Christchurch call came about as a bipartisan global international effort, and now has moved into the nonprofit space, I think will help us to offer us some very interesting perspectives. So I'll just start off the conversation by asking Andy a few questions, getting his perspective on things. And I believe we'll also have time for some questions from the audience as well. So we'll make sure that we'll have some ample time and room for that. So one of the things I wanted to start off with, Andy, and ask you is that obviously youth and countering violent extremism among youth is one of the focal points right now of the Christchurch Calls Foundation's work, and it's driving some of your efforts in the coming years. Can you just tell us a little bit more about that? And what are you concerned specifically in terms of youth engagement with extremism? This has obviously been quite a big thing in Australia as well, too. We've had some government efforts through YAMHAG and through other areas. We've had the AFP highlighting over the years around the risk of the declining ages in terms of the population, but also the risks to young people as well. So from the foundation's perspective, can you tell us a little bit more about what the concerns are that you see, but also how you're working through the foundation to help address some of that?
Yeah, absolutely. Firstly, thank you, Lydia. And thank you, Michelle and Julian, for inviting me here. It's just so wonderful to see so many people in the room. First became involved with AVERT a few years ago. It's an amazing institution, and the growth that we've seen is both scary from my perspective because it shows the depths that humanity is sinking to in terms that this number of people need to be involved in these studies and these research, but it's really heartening to see and have so many really, really good conversations going on. So firstly, I want to note that along with Deakin University and Voxpol and a big shout out for their TASM conference next year, which I'm really looking forward to. So thank you. So yeah, youth is a big concern for us. For me personally, first and foremost, the reason why I'm most concerned about it is because I have a 15-year-old and a 12-year-old who are growing up in this environment, a connected online world, which is nothing like the world that I grew up in. And I think even for the younger people in this room, it's nothing like the world that they grew up in preteen times. The technologies and the possibilities in your cell phone right there are infinitely beyond what I was watching on sci-fi movies when I grew up. Yeah. We could not imagine that. And I think the advances in AI and the advances in the other technologies that we're seeing now are way beyond what we were even imagining 2, 3, 5 years ago. So I want my son and daughter, I want that entire global generation to grow up embracing those possibilities of what's out there, because it's way beyond what we could have imagined before. Embrace the global connections, the access to knowledge. I don't want to overblow this, but humanity's unprecedented opportunities for innovation and change that this technology brings, that are free, open, secure. Internet can bring for all of us. But I think we all know, because we live in this much darker version of that world, that that's not the reality for a lot of parts of the internet. That the youth are exposed to things that we were never exposed to growing up, whether they want to be or not. And I've seen firsthand what the worst versions of humanity and that online radicalization can do. I saw that in Christchurch, and we've seen it in countless other instances around the world, where that online radicalizing environment, the online exposure, the desensitization to violence has brought around horrific real world harm as well as online harm. So people in this room are shining a critical light into those dark spaces. It's absolutely crucial that we do more there. We can't hide from this. We can't uninvent the internet. It's not going away. It's getting much more complex. But we can shape it. We can mold it. We can set expectations of what we will accept as society, and we can draw lines in the sand on those pieces. for those who build it, those who own it, those who use it, so we can collectively make it better for the next generation, which is the positive version. And I think acknowledging and collectively understanding that new, rapidly evolving online world is the critical first step for that. So you've articulated really well the mission of the Christchurch School. We are here to eliminate terrorist and violent extremist content online, while upholding human rights. That's a really crucial part of what we do, and preserving a free, open, secure internet. Those are critical parts of it. Leaders of the Christchurch School community, and the community is over 160 strong. It's 55 governments, including Australia, who have formally signed up to commitments within that call. It's 19 major tech companies who have signed up to commitments on that, alongside academics, civil society leaders, and others around the globe. And leaders of that community have made youth a very specific priority. And that's because the evidence is clear that young people are uniquely vulnerable to online radicalization. So, for example, if we look at Europe, data from Europol indicates that the number of minors and young people involved in terrorist and violent extremist activities in the EU continues to grow. Around 30% of suspects arrested for terrorist offences in the EU are between 12 and 20 years old. 12 and 20 years old. That's really scary to me. Yeah. These suspects, and nobody will be surprised in this room, these suspects are predominantly male and often underwent processes of self-radicalization online. I think we're all well aware of that. And nowadays they're not involved with any kind of centralized organization. They're acting alone in small cells with peers in their own little online environments. It's a trend that's also evident here in Australia. It's the same in New Zealand, Canada, the US. There was a report that the Five Eyes community put out earlier this year or late last year that specifically called for a whole of society response to this problem of youth. It's widely recognised. So that I think there are a few unique factors that drive this concern around youth. First, they're early adopters, digital natives of technology. I see both my son and daughter jumping on things that I've never heard of, half their peers have never heard of, because it's the thing that they get linked to and get put into. Young people spend significant amounts of time online, even though I try to stop them, but they still do, and often on platforms where extremist content can circulate really quickly. The second factor for me is that blended online-offline worlds. Many young people, there's no clear divide between online and online life. Online spaces simply amplify real-world grievances, identities, good and bad, making radicalization pathways harder to detect and disrupt. And the third one I'd identify here is the exposure and susceptibility. Young people are more likely to encounter extremist narratives through social media, through gaming communities, influencer-driven content. And in some cases, these narratives are gamified to make recruitment much more appealing. And we heard a few sessions yesterday. About that.
I mean, from what you're saying, it's really striking to me. Like, a couple of things that you mentioned is, you talked about your role as a parent and the role that parents can play, or guardians and adults in there. I mean, there seems to be a little bit of a disconnect, I think, at times between adults who have particular concerns and then younger generations sometimes who say, well, take a look at what adults are doing online as well. I mean, sometimes I take a look at my parents and their friends and what they come across online. And so it seems like, yes, you articulated very well some of the susceptibilities, particularly in this violent extremist space with youth, but it is very much a broader problem. And you highlighted that when you talked about the transformational nature, I think, of the technology. It really is truly a Promethean moment, I think, that we're in terms of the developments with artificial intelligence. Like, it does very much strike me that we are in a completely different realm, even from 10 years ago, in the way that we're talking about technologies, online spaces. It's quite different. But I wanted to press you a little bit about something you said with the goal of shaping the internet, right? So the Christchurch Foundation, it's a massive effort, and it's so impressive how you've been able to coordinate so many different bodies and actors and stakeholders in this process. So not just governments, not just academics, not just civil society folks, but actually the tech companies themselves. But we know, like, there's so many conversations going around about our concerns around these things, people wanting to make changes, governments wanting to make changes. But the reality that we're up against is that it is platforms and tech companies that are held in the hands of a few. And that makes it quite difficult for us to shape the environment in the way that we want to go in. But the foundation is making still a lot of efforts and strides in that space in terms of their engagement with the owners of these platforms. So can you talk a little bit about that and that tension, or where you see areas of cooperation, where you see limits in terms of the holders of these platforms?
Yeah, absolutely. There's no doubt we live in challenging times in that space. There are major, I mean, all of the major tech firms have rowed back significantly on their trust and safety efforts over the last year, with very few exceptions. Entire trust and safety teams have been disestablished. And a lot of the measures that we worked really hard with them to put in place over the last few years have now gone. And that's a really challenging environment. The Christchurch School has always been built around multi-stakeholderism. So fundamentally, I deeply believe that we all have a role to play in this, whether it's governments and policymakers who have big levers on this, the tech firms themselves, and we naturally sort of tend towards some of the big ones there, but we shouldn't forget that there's a lot of smaller players in that market who are not necessarily doing some of the same things that Meta and X and others have done over the last 12 months. In fact, we've had some amazing engagement from particularly the gaming community throughout that period, and they are deeply involved in a lot of the projects that we're doing, and they really want to advance some of this work. So it's not all doom and gloom on the tech side. But I think we should not overlook the role that academics, researchers, civil society organizations can play in this. We absolutely should not underestimate the power that shining a light and advocating for change and pushing for change has. Fundamentally, these are companies driven by the bottom line. And if you can shine a light on the practices that happen on their platforms, you can often influence them to change. Sometimes it takes global programs and global media to cover that.
But that's very interesting that you said that some of the smaller platforms and the gaming platforms are doing more of that work now, or you're seeing that, because bringing it back to the youth space, with young people's use of the internet and gaming platforms, that's kind of where they are, not necessarily these major platforms that the broader population is. So that's an interesting development.
The only people talking about Facebook are my age and older.
Right. So one of the big efforts, I think, after the Christchurch attacks that the Christchurch Call Foundation did was doing a really huge lift in galvanizing the takedown of violent and abhorrent material online. Because we know with that attack, not only was it a physical attack that happened that against two targets that killed a number of people, but it was streamed online on purpose, right? And so that amplified the impact of that attack in ways that we've now come to understand. And so one of the things that the call has done is to try to at least mitigate that bit of the effect. So there was huge efforts around hashtag protocols and establishing that. I was hoping you can talk a little bit about the progress of that work, but also other past incidents around violent extremist and terrorist attacks. Have they also driven innovations or lessons learned in terms of the countering space in the online environment? So we see very clearly how the Christchurch attack prompted action on that front. Are there others that are also informing current policy and platform engagement?
Absolutely. We have seen huge changes. There were a lot of positives here. So I'll talk a little bit about ever since the creation of the Christchurch School by New Zealand and France and all of the supporters, companies and governments that there's been a commitment amongst our community to have processes in place to enable coordinated rapid response when terrorist incidents occur, particularly the first 24, 48 hours. What we saw with Christchurch was not just the live streaming of that attack, but somewhat horrifically, in the first 48 hours after that attack, over 4 million copies of that video were uploaded onto major platforms.
This is the Christchurch attack.
From the Christchurch attack. That's, to me, a mind-blowing number. And this was not an era of AI and bots quite to the same level that we are now. So that is a huge number of individuals loading up that video. And probably tens of millions of people were exposed to at least part of it through that process. So that was the driver behind the creation of what we call the Crisis Response Protocol, which enables information sharing between all of our community when an incident occurs. So that anytime there's a significant online content component as part of an attack, whether it be a live stream, a manifesto, bystander footage, whatever it might be that is potentially harmful or objectionable, then the intent of the Crisis Response Protocol is to stop the spread of that content and messages of hate.
Can you give us an example or two of when that's been triggered recently?
Absolutely. I think the Annunciation Church shooting in Minnesota was probably the most high-profile recent example of that one. But Buffalo shooting, various others since then. The Annunciation shooting was an interesting one. It really highlighted an evolution in the tactics and the features being used by attackers and those who are around them. So the attackers scheduled 2 videos to go live on YouTube at the same time as the attack took place. There was a lot of pre-planning in that. And those videos had characteristics, whether it was by design or not, that allowed them to evade automated detection. There have been huge strides over the last few years in automated detection mechanisms. And so it is quite difficult now to load horrifically violent and certainly to do live stream versions of that. But that attacker did, and it highlights the need for adaptive detection systems. The incident also reflected a broader trend, and we had a whole session on it yesterday, of the nihilistic violence piece, which, whether it's that particular strand or various other ideologies and trends that we're seeing, it just shows that there's much more unusual elements to the traditional version of the propaganda that groups were putting out, and so responding to that has been a real challenge. The critical part that we're now building into the crisis response mechanism is a much more in-depth debriefing process. So normally about a month after an attack like that happens, we will try to bring all of the stakeholders together, the tech firms on which content was produced, the policymakers from including the government of where the incident occurred, civil society organizations and others, to look at what happened and what lessons that we can learn from those particular incidents. Some of those lessons are very technical, but others are much more kind of societal. So, yeah.
So you had mentioned a little bit earlier when you were saying you see this very much as whole of society, that even though the power is held in the hands of a few companies, there's still a huge role to play for the research community, for civil society, for average citizens to try to push for change. What advice would you have, say for people in this room, academics and practitioners and policymakers trying to push forward positive change within that kind of multi-stakeholder dialogue model?
First and foremost, as researchers, academics, civil society groups, I think it's crucial to recognize your power. I don't think all the power sits in the hands of a small number of tech oligarchs. I think the power still very much sits with the people, and we've seen that in various different countries where we've seen very significant change brought about by high quality research, by high quality advocacy and pressure being put onto through governments or directly into these tech companies. So don't underestimate your role. It is a massive role. Researchers and civil society organizations are often the bridge between communities, between policymakers and up to platforms. So I think that's first and foremost, you bring evidence, you bring lived experience, you bring credibility that governments and tech firms just cannot replicate. So researchers' insights can shape absolutely shape global norms. They can influence regulation. You can hold platforms to account, and you should. So be bold, be evidence-driven, but don't be afraid to speak truth to power. Do that in the rigorous ways that we know that only academics and researchers really can, but you occupy this unique part of the landscape to help us both understand the nature of the problems and to collectively develop solutions. The other point I think I'd just make on this is to really push for design level solutions on this. We're very much advocates of safety by design. AI rollout has been the opposite of this, I think it would be fair to say. We would like to see much better and much earlier conversations with tech companies to try to understand the nature of the technology that is being pushed out before it hits users' front ends. So we're not trying to deal with the solutions after afterwards. There's been some good willing. I mean, the AI chatbots pushing you towards suicide is a clear example where the tech firms have seen a problem with what they've pushed out and responded rapidly to it. But we don't want to be in the situation where we're having to do that. We want to be able to anticipate these problems. That means fast and rapid research on some very rapidly changing technologies. Keeping up with that is incredibly difficult. But yeah, really push for those. Push on the tech firms.
Yep. Yeah, it doesn't seem to, I mean, it's a little bit disheartening to see that we haven't really learned the lessons from the social media rollout and applying to AI. But it is interesting to see some of the surveys around people's trust in the level of especially generative AI tools. And it seems like people are walking into it a bit more skeptically than they did, or a bit more carefully than they did social media. So that might be a kind of a silver lining in terms of, I think the change is so big and change can be so confronting that there is maybe a natural inclination for some to push back, but then you roll it back to the youth spaces and they don't tend to have maybe some of those concerns. Do you see more of an embrace of younger generations in AI tools in the work that you're doing?
Yes, definitely. I don't think there's necessarily a less distrust. More trust, less, yeah. Amongst that generation, I think there is more digital literacy amongst that generation than probably we give them credit for. But I think there's a huge amount more that we need to be doing in schools, through parents, in all of the environments that they live in to understand better. The problem is that we don't understand the environment that they live in, which is where the research comes in. But I think. For me, it's slightly worrying that the reason why we're skeptical about AI, by and large, if you're a person on the street, is that you've seen some of the more ridiculous versions of what AI has produced, because the media has shown up the more perverse answers that it's giving to questions, or some of the ridiculous. It shouldn't take that for you to have bring a skeptical mind to this, and the ease of access to this, the way that even in the last 12 months that this has been rolled out. Take Google as an example. I don't know if people are now scrolling down to click onto the websites below. Google isn't effectively an AI tool, and you're putting your search in, and a lot of people now are just reading the AI responses. And we need to understand what that is, where it's come from. And why we should trust it, in the same way that we needed to understand what websites were and who was behind those, because they were not always trustworthy either.
So keeping with this, the AI theme, can you talk a bit more about the risk specifically with terrorist and violent extremist content? You know, how do you see the exploitation of artificial intelligence driving that? And then conversely, how might AI then be used to address or counter some of the violent extremist content online, or not just content, but the building up of communities? You spoke a little bit about automated detection of some of that, but maybe there are other ways that you can, or things that are happening that you can share with us.
I think first and foremost, we don't have all the answers, but it's a major focus, major focus for us. So let's start with some of the risks. There are many, but I'll probably just highlight 3 here, and there will be people in this room who will have much more in-depth knowledge on a lot of these. But the first category of risk for me is related to terrorist exploitation of AI for propaganda production and amplification. We know generative AI is being used to produce text, audio, video that advances terrorist narratives. And a lot of research has shown that these actors are not only using these AI tools, but actively sharing strategies to circumvent safeguards around their use. So we've seen that with ISIS magazines, we've seen that with white nationalist groups, demonstrating increasing sophistication around operational security and AI use. We've also observed how AI is leveraged to manipulate post-crisis information environments. So when an incident occurs, they will very rapidly produce disinformation and propaganda. 7th of October attacks is a classic example of this. The internet was flooded with AI content from a multitude of sources. More recently, AI-generated videos released by News Harvest, which is an ISIS-affiliated media program. After the Moscow theater attack in 2024, we saw, we've seen a step change in the ability to rapidly produce very convincing material in those spaces. The second category of risk, I think, is around the nature of human AI interactions and their capacity to exacerbate vulnerability. So we're concerned about the impacts of dependence on AI, both for information gathering and then increasingly this emotional connection piece. So we've seen how AI models can both introduce and reinforce grievances that motivate violence, and that's a really worrying trend for me. And then just the third one I'll highlight is actually the intersection of the prior two, both propaganda production and radicalization, and that is best exemplified by companion AIs. And I think we're just starting to scratch the surface on their capabilities there. But AI companion apps obviously enable people to build and publicly share AI personas, and this offers a completely new platform for the dissemination of terrorist and violent extremist propaganda and ideologies in a way that connects on a personal level with people in a way that we've never seen before.
And do you find that that might have some implications for recruitment as well? So we talk about amplification of content and propaganda, but do you see AI fulfilling a role in either in organizations using it to help or assist in their recruitment processes, or in a self-radicalization type of scenario?
I think we're absolutely seeing that already. I don't know to what extent that is, an active strategy of any group, because the groups don't necessarily work in that way. But I think we're seeing an evolution of people grabbing these opportunities when they hold these beliefs to draw others in, and they will try stuff terrorists are incredibly adaptive at getting around the safeguards that are put in place and in grasping these opportunities that these new technologies bring. So they will try something. If it works, if it brings people into the group, then absolutely. And if it doesn't, then they'll move on. But I think these are just new possibilities that all of these things are bringing. There are positive sides, of course, to the AI space. As you said, there's opportunities here, immense opportunities to counter the threat. So just as extremists can use AI to undermine information environments, of course, we can use it to strengthen them. We've got to grasp those opportunities as well. We've got to factor it into our policy making. We've got to factor it into our research, so that we can better understand. I think we're just scratching the surface at the moment, and I don't think anybody really knows how properly to leverage AI for good for that. But it can help design more effective countermeasure campaigns. It can design campaigns to connect with vulnerable individuals, the flip side of the persona connection. And it can enhance crisis response. And we're working with companies to see how we can use it to enhance that. So there's a lot of possibilities here.
Yeah. So maybe this might be a good time to open it up to the audience if folks have any questions. I've still got a couple more I'd like to ask Andy, but want to leave time for people if any of this has sparked any questions or comments or reflections from anyone there. I see Michelle's hand up.
Michelle's always first.
Yes. And Malcolm's got a hand up. So
I'm happy for somebody else to go first.
no, that's all right. I think we're just going to wait for the
Grab
mics
some
for a
mics.
second.
Thanks very much. Look, I have so many questions, but I will limit myself to one for now. So, look, you've talked, Andy, about the big levers that government has relative to the tech companies.
Yeah.
At the same time that you've also talked about the rollback, of trust and say. So we're looking at something of a paradox here.
Yeah.
Right? And I think it raises the question for me of your assessment of the appetite and or reluctance on the part of governments to use the big levers. So first of all, what are those big levers? And second of all, what is the appetite to use them? Or alternatively, what are some of the barriers or reluctance to actually pull them? Because I think until we understand the paradox that we're currently in at the moment, it's hard to see how those levers are actually functioning as we perhaps would like them to.
Yeah. I mean, I think first and foremost, from a government perspective, the key lever that they have at their disposal, that we collectively have, as part of states, is regulation. Australia has led the way in a lot of that pushback against tech companies through regulation, not necessarily directly in this space, but in others. The EU is another really good example. The Digital Services Act in the EU is a huge step forward in terms of pushing back on tech firms and saying, look, this is where we draw the line and understand this is what we want. This is what we want the future of our digital services across the European bloc to look like. So I think there's absolutely times when those big regulatory and legal levers can and should be pulled. I wouldn't want to overemphasize, though, necessarily that regulation is the way forward, because we've seen in this rapidly changing environment, even legislation that was brought in this decade, so within the last 4 or 5 years, is now massively out of date because it just didn't anticipate the technology challenges. In that space, the EU is struggling with some of that. Many countries are struggling with outdated legislation around these pieces. So I think there's absolutely a place for that. I think though, governments speak on behalf of their societies, and I think we can push our governments to, and this is where I think the evidence base comes in. This is where I think researchers comes in, is arm them with the tools to understand the problem. And develop really good, high-quality policy in conjunction, hopefully, with some of those tech firms. Because I don't think throw a problem over the fence at them and say you need to solve this is the way to go. We strongly believe in multi-stakeholder solutions to these problems. That is very difficult when at the senior level the tech firms won't necessarily come around the table, but ultimately the tech firms in the US are bending to the political winds of what is happening there. We shouldn't underestimate, though, that it's not just about the US government, it's about the totality of global governments. Asian governments, Antipodean governments, European governments have a very strong role to play in driving what the global norms are going to be for the internet. And so we should push our governments to be proactive, forward-looking and solution-driven on all of these pieces. I don't know if you had any thoughts on.
No, I think that's good. We can take a question from Malcolm. Yeah.
That's okay.
No, it's difficult for the rest of the room, so we'll just yeah.
Thanks both. Really interesting discussion. I just want to pick up on something Lydia said, going back to the Christchurch attack and the idea that the live stream of that attack was an amplification of the attack itself. And Andy's point too that there were 4 million downloads or something of that. Because so much of the discussion around online extremism has been framed in terms of extremist propaganda, pathways to violent extremism, recruitment, these types of issues.
Yeah.
But to think of it as an amplification of the attack itself is to also think about extremist material as a weapon designed to inflict harm on the community. And if I think back to March 2019 and the work that I was doing in New South Wales, in Sydney, with Muslim communities, the amount of Muslim parents I met who watched the live stream with their children in the lounge room.
Yeah.
Right. So some of those downloads you're talking about are from the victim target community here itself. So it also opened up a discussion around what we're doing in the community around recognizing the harms that online extremism can present, which is not necessarily just an online. Obviously, we need the online solutions that you're talking about as well, but particularly from a kind of a community resilience perspective, where's the piece of work that we need to do with communities to say you're exposing yourself to harm by being exposed to this material?
I think you've hit it on the head there. There's the intersection between the online and offline worlds is utterly blurred. So anything, we at the Christchurch School are very much focused on the online environment because that's where we live and breathe. But it's the role for community groups, the role for civil society organisations, the role for local councils, state and territory governments to be working directly with those communities. That's where the harm occurs. The harm is occurring to people in the real world. And you're absolutely right. There's a few reasons why that terrorist live streamed and went to the effort he did to make that material available online. But one of those was to amplify the harm. And we still see that harm. I'm in contact with people who, on a very regular basis, who are part of the affected community in Christchurch, who get sent that video, who very deliberately get sent that video to re-traumatize them, to inflict greater harm on them. And that is a horrifically dark side of humanity, but it's very, very much the real world harms. And so working, whether it's councillors or local councils or federal level work to support those communities is absolutely crucial. I think we saw that after 7th of October and the inter-community tensions that arose there. A lot of that was online, but a huge amount of that is offline, and we can't divorce the two. Absolutely can't.
I think it's a great point that you bring up, Malcolm, because we are so often think of, say, content or propaganda or information as something quite separate. One of the ways that it helps me to think about it is actually referring back to the way that militaries kind of conceptualize domains. And we've got to think of the online space as its own domain, right? And things happening in that domain in terms of both attack and counterattack, and drawing on kind of older notions of information warfare, perhaps, in order to help us think about it. Because in our space that we come from a very different conceptual mindset in terms of how we think about these. So perhaps kind of learning from the way other industries or sectors take a look at it, that it is very much its own domain. And it kind of goes to the theme of the conference around taking a look at, or with different places and spaces, and bringing it back to last year's conference, how we thought about those things. So not separating out those two. We've got time for a couple of questions, if there are any. I do have one question for you. We've got one here, but can I ask you one quick one before we move to the lady in the back? You've got a room full of researchers and practitioners. You say in your remarks, you mentioned a lot of questions that still need answering, a lot of things that you're still exploring. Throw out some of those to the crowd. What should the researchers and practitioners be thinking about in terms of the questions we need to start thinking about answering, or what we need to be paying attention to help address some of the challenges that you guys are all looking to help ameliorate in the foundation? Okay.
There are so many. I don't think it will surprise you from what I've said already. I think the if there were a couple of areas that I would highlight, the first one is new technology and new tech spaces. So I think it's not even an evolution of AI, whatever the faster version of evolution is, keeping up with and understanding what that looks like is going to be incredibly challenging for us globally, because otherwise we will always be one step behind, and we will be finding these things out through the worst possible ways when it really goes badly wrong, versus understanding what sits behind that. So not just AI, there's a variety of other technologies, but that would be first and foremost. The world is changing and changing rapidly, and that's what's driving it.
So does that call for greater interdisciplinary work? I think between a lot of us, say in the social sciences and the humanities, who are looking at that stuff, and those that are looking, say data scientists or
I don't think there's enough technologists and data scientists in this space. And quite rightly, we've looked at it not exclusively, but predominantly through a humanities social lens over the last few years. We need to bring those together, those two in particular. But it always needs to be multidisciplinary on this. Bert knows that much better than I do. The other couple of spaces I would highlight: youth. How we deal with youth, it's a unique challenge, and anybody who has worked in the youth space will know that there are unique differences in the way that you need to work with young people. Whether you're a psychologist or looking at the online environment, it's vastly different to the world that we know and the approaches that you need to take in the real world. So I think much more examination of what world they are growing up in and how we can much better influence that. Without being the preachy parents who are just taking the phones away, because that's just not the the long-term solution to this. And then finally, I think comes to actually the point you made around what levers do we have now, and how can a new version of multi-stakeholderism, how can we put pressure onto not just the big tech firms, but onto governments, onto institutions, onto wherever the decisions are being made about what the future of this looks like? How can we put pressure in a evidence-driven, solutions-driven, safety by design way, so that we can come to this from a position of knowledge and power, not just making this up as we go along, which by and large, profit-driven companies and governments that are being pulled in every single direction, and this is just one of them. And there's so many other, even in the online space, there's so many other forms of harm here that they're getting pulled into. So there's a lot of busy people. We need to arm them with the tools and solutions.
Yeah. We've got a question back there. If we can bring a mic. You wouldn't mind just raising your hand so they can see. Anyone here? Oh. Yes.
Hi, I'm Deborah Udall. I'm a professor of education at Macquarie University. You mentioned as you started, you made a sort of side note to the question of rights and freedom.
Yeah.
And you just talked about dealing with youth, and I made a little smart aside about dealing with youth. So I want to, as you've been talking, I've been thinking about other areas in education where we deal with youth. And sorry, I'll stop having a go at you about it.
Yeah.
So I was thinking in particular about some of the ways that children with particular diagnoses of special needs get attended to in the education system, and the ways that particular sorts of trajectories are set up for them through education systems, and it particularly, so I'm thinking about work by, let me give them a name check. Julie Allen and Valerie Harwood wrote a really great book called Psychopathology at School, and it traces the way that when children are 4 or 5, they get treated as needing help and support, but by the time they're teenagers, so they're treated as vulnerable. But by the time they're teenagers, they're treated as a threat that needs to be managed and removed. And so I think that, so I was thinking about this as you were talking, and I was thinking about the tensions between universal responses, which aim to capture every child or every young people, and responses that seem to have the capacity to correctly identify children and young people who need, I'm trying to be really careful with my language, who we might want to engage productively. And so I wanted you to talk a bit about that universal approach to young people, like the social media ban that we're about to have, a more nuanced approach, and how you see us managing the challenge of respecting children's rights and their freedoms to think things that we might not think ourselves, and the real danger.
So we might just, for the sake of time, take the couple of the last questions. I think there's a gentleman here, and then Michelle, if we can get all those questions, and then Andy, I'll throw it over to you to respond how you can.
Hi, Andy.
Cam, how are you?
You've been very diplomatic, and it's great to give the cry from the heart to keep hope alive for design solutions, regulatory solutions, which I agree with you could solve so many of our problems, even if we're at a time where that seems rather forlorn. So while we hope for those to eventuate, for those of us who work in agencies that have got our heels back on the goal line trying to save the day and deal with some of the manifestations of this problem, how do these organizations need to evolve? We've often been very, very slow to adapt to the world of the internet. How do we need to evolve to be as successful as we can be while we hope that we will design out or regulate out some of the harms that these systems are creating?
Thank you. And then Michelle, you want to?
So I just wanted to come back to your point about companion AI, what need that fills, because I think you're absolutely right. Those companion AIs offer a form of a simulated intimacy. Yeah. The question is, so it's a kind of mantra in CVE that we need to understand and deal with social isolation. Social isolation is not quite the same as loneliness. No. Yeah. And I'm wondering, what you see as the prospects for us to stem or offer alternatives, perhaps using some of the same technologies, although I would not necessarily support that. But first it's the diagnosis. Is it isolation? Or is it loneliness, which are actually two different things? Do we need to look at, our own forms of AI influence, right? Because social influence, in the end, is what moves people in terms of attitude, feelings, and behavior. But there are huge risks, particularly for governments, right, in engaging in that. So I'm just wondering if you can talk a little bit about where you see the companion intimacy and response issues going.
Thanks, Michelle. So we've got three very good but different questions. So one on how we can balance the rights of younger people and their human rights and versus attempts to protect and to safeguard around vulnerabilities that they have. How can frontline organizations evolve absent bigger changes, broader changes on the nation state, platform level? And also what needs AI is filling in here. We're speaking generative AI, right? Because we talk about AI, it's that's a big term. There's lots of things that go under AI, right? But say we're talking generative AI, what needs is it potentially fulfilling? And, Michelle, you might be referring to things about how generative AI is increasingly sycophantic and what that fulfills for people in terms of their engagement with it. So feel free to take all or some of these in the 5 minutes we've got left.
I'll start with the youth one. Look, I couldn't agree more with your perspective. I'm using some generalized terms when it comes to global youth, but the solutions to this are individual and local. The solutions are in individual programs and individual schools and working in exactly the way that you've described. And I think this is a fantastic example of why we need multidisciplinary approaches to some of these issues to bring people who have deep expertise in one field, which has been an area that has not traditionally been associated with, 10 years ago, if we were talking about counterterrorism, we would have had predominantly law enforcement type people in the room having these conversations. And we know that the solutions don't lie solely there. They lie in this whole spectrum of different societal approaches. I think human rights at every level have to be an integral part of those pieces. I think that's as true in Australia as it is in every country around the world. I think you've been at the forefront of some of that human rights work traditionally, and long may that continue. But I couldn't agree more with the approaches that you're putting forward. Cam, great to see you, fellow New Zealander. How are you? I don't think, I mean, we both know that hope is not a solution to these things. I have painted a slightly rosy view of this, but it is deep and dark, the hole that we find ourselves in with some of the technology around this. I am inherently, though, an optimist. I think if we can collectively galvanize all of society approaches onto this, what we've seen in the last 12 months has been a big rowback on some really good progress, though, that was made over the 5 years prior to that. Some lights were shone on this issue, and by and large, with some exceptions, but by and large, the technology companies did take that seriously, and they did work really hard to do that. And many of them still are, particularly at the mid-sized firms and the gaming environments that we've talked so much about. They're still working really hard on that. I'm hopeful that political cycles and others will bring us out, but over time we will need to find a new way to engage. The engagement with the big tech firms is not going to be the same as the engagement was 5 years ago. We will need to find new ways of doing that. That will be new champions standing up and speaking on behalf of our collective societies, whether that's through governments or through NGOs or out of the academic community. We need to stand up for what's right and push them. Ultimately, they are driven by the bottom line. So that's where I would suggest putting the pressure. And we've seen big changes, even in the current environment. We've seen big changes when national and international campaigns have highlighted major problems with these platforms. We should continue to drive to create those champions to find the solutions. That would be my suggestion there. Companions AIs, I have no idea. They're new to me. And I've not tried them. So I think this is a classic example of a technology that has appeared so rapidly. Literally in the course of the last few months, where so much more examination behind what are the psychological factors behind people being drawn to that, and how does the whole interplay between the individual, the human being on one side, and the companion AI on the other side work. And I think in 5 years' time we will see a very new, completely different version. And I have no idea what that looks like either. But we're entering a very different world, that world of sci-fi that we couldn't imagine 20 years ago. So.
Well, thank you so much, Andy. I know I'm with a clever person when they always say what they don't know. So we've learned a lot from your perspectives. And thank you to everyone for the good questions. And I really appreciated your perspective from the multi-stakeholder lens, and also that call of maintaining optimism in a space which is difficult. And I think it attests to the fact that all of us here are in the room. We're all working in very difficult spaces, but we're gathering, we're doing our work because we still remain optimistic about that. So just join me in thanking Andy, and we'll stand up and show.
And of course, let's take it as read that that was thanking both Andy and Lydia for a really fabulous dialogue. Absolutely fascinating and important in terms of thinking through some of these almost intractable questions. So very